QAnon didn't just break America, it hacked the way human beings process reality itself. I'm going to show you exactly how one anonymous account posting cryptic riddles on the darkest corner of the internet turned millions of ordinary people into believers in a secret war that never existed. But here's what makes this different from every other conspiracy documentary you've watched. I'm not here to mock the people who fell for it. I'm here to show you the system that made it inevitable. Because QAnon wasn't random. It was engineered, not by one mastermind, but by the perfect collision of human psychology, algorithmic incentives, and a culture that had stopped agreeing on what truth even means. By the end of this investigation, I'm going to give you something no one else will. The three-question test that exposes any viral conspiracy in minutes, not hours of research, not a PhD in media literacy. 3 questions, and once you have them, you'll never look at information the same way again. But here's your challenge. While you watch this, I want you to test yourself. Every time you feel that dopamine rush, that moment where something clicks and you think, this explains everything, I want you to pause and ask, am I following evidence or am I following a feeling? Because that's what QAnon did. It didn't convince people with facts. It convinced them with feelings. And the scariest part? It worked on people just like you. Subscribe now if you want investigations that go deeper than headlines. And stick with me because what I'm about to show you isn't just about QAnon. It's about the next one. The one that's coming. The one that won't even use the name. Let's go back to October 28th, 2017, the day it all began. The first Q post appeared on 4chan's /poll board at 2:44 p.m. Eastern Time. It was 87 words long. It asked a series of questions about Hillary Clinton, Saudi Arabia, and military intelligence. It signed off with a single letter, Q. Now, here's what you need to understand. That first post was nothing. It made no specific predictions. It offered no verifiable information. It was deliberately vague, deliberately cryptic, deliberately open to interpretation. And that was the entire point. Because QAnon didn't spread by being right. It spread by making people feel like they were figuring something out. The post wasn't information. It was a puzzle. And humans are hardwired to solve puzzles. Think about the last time you solved a crossword clue or figured out the twist in a movie before the reveal. Remember that little rush? That sense of, I'm smart, I got it? That's exactly what Q drops gave people, hundreds of times a day. But here's the question you should be asking right now. Why did it work so well on platforms that were supposedly designed to stop misinformation? The answer is going to disturb you. Within 48 hours, the Q posts had spawned dozens of decoders, amateur analysts who would take each cryptic drop and create elaborate threads explaining what it really meant. They'd connect random news events to random parts of the drop. They'd find patterns in timestamps. They'd create charts and maps and timelines. And here's the beautiful, terrible truth. It didn't matter if any of it was real. The act of decoding was the product. The community that formed around decoding was the product. The feeling of being an insider, of seeing what the sheep couldn't see, that was the product. QAnon weaponized something psychologists call apophenia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. We evolved to be pattern seekers because in a dangerous world, the cost of missing a real pattern, that rustling in the bushes really is a predator, was death. But the cost of seeing a false pattern, that cloud looks like a face, was just embarrassment. So we're biased toward seeing patterns, even when they're not there. QAnon didn't fight that bias. It fed it, constantly, relentlessly. By November 2017, the movement had its first catchphrase, where we go one, we go all. G1WGA. It appeared on bumper stickers, t-shirts, hashtags. It transformed individual pattern seeking into collective pattern seeking. You weren't alone in your rabbit hole anymore. You had a community. And communities have rules. Communities have rituals. Communities have heroes and villains. The heroes were patriots who were awake. The villains were everyone else, the cabal, the deep state, the mainstream media, anyone who questioned the drops. And the ritual? The ritual was endless research, endless decoding, endless waiting for the storm. Here's what I want you to notice. At no point did Q have to be correct about anything for this to work. In fact, being vague meant Q could never be proven wrong. Every failed prediction could be reinterpreted. Every contradiction could be explained as disinformation is necessary. Every delay could be reframed as part of the plan. This is what philosophers call an unfalsifiable hypothesis, a claim that's structured so that no evidence can possibly disprove it. And unfalsifiable hypotheses aren't theories. They're beliefs. They're faith. But before you think, well, I'd never fall for that, let me ask you something. Have you ever believed something felt true even when you couldn't quite prove it? Have you ever dismissed evidence because it came from a source you didn't trust? Have you ever felt like you understood something that other people were too blind or too brainwashed to see? That's not stupidity. That's being human. And QAnon was designed for humans. Now here's where it gets dangerous, because in December 2017, QAnon escaped the Chans. It found Facebook. It found YouTube. It found Twitter. And when it did, it found the most powerful distribution network in human history, the algorithm. Stay with me. Because what happens next is how a fringe conspiracy became a mainstream movement. Let me show you exactly how the algorithm works and why it was basically designed to spread QAnon. Every social media platform has the same core goal: keep you scrolling, keep you watching, keep you clicking, because the longer you stay, the more ads they serve. The more ads they serve, the more money they make. So the algorithm learns what keeps you engaged. And here's what it learned. Uncertainty plus emotion plus identity equals engagement. QAnon gave the algorithm all three, constantly. The Q drops created uncertainty. What does this mean? What's coming? What's the storm? That uncertainty kept people checking for updates, refreshing boards, waiting for the next drop. That's pure engagement. The narrative created emotion, righteous anger at the cabal, fear of what they were supposedly doing to children, hope that the patriots were going to win. Emotion drives shares. Emotion drives comments. Emotion drives time on platform. And the community created identity. You weren't just a person who read some posts. You were a digital soldier. You were a researcher. You were awake. Identity drives loyalty. Identity drives return visits. Identity drives tribes. The algorithm didn't care if any of it was true. The algorithm cared if it worked. And it worked spectacularly. Within 6 months, QAnon-related content was getting millions of views on YouTube. Thousands of Facebook groups had formed around decoding drops. Instagram accounts were repackaging Q content as aesthetic infographics. Twitter threads were going viral. And here's the insidious part. The people spreading it didn't think they were spreading a conspiracy theory. They thought they were spreading research. They thought they were spreading truth. They'd say things like, "I'm just asking questions," or "do your own research," or "think for yourself." But here's what that really meant. Trust my sources, not mainstream sources. Trust my interpretation, not expert interpretation. Trust my community, not your own judgment. This is a classic cult recruitment tactic, by the way. You isolate people from their existing information sources. You give them new sources that only the in-group trusts. You make leaving the group feel like betrayal. Now you might be thinking, but platforms eventually cracked down on QAnon content, right? They banned accounts, they removed groups, they demoted conspiracy content in the algorithm. They did, starting in 2020. After 3 years of exponential growth, after millions of people had already been pulled in, after QAnon had already become a household name. And here's the critical question: why did it take so long? The answer is uncomfortable. Platforms were making too much money. QAnon content was incredibly engaging. It drove massive amounts of interaction. Every share, every comment, every heated argument in the replies, that was revenue. That was growth metrics. That was investor confidence. So platforms made a calculation. The reputational risk of allowing it was less than the financial risk of stopping it. Until it wasn't. Until QAnon believers started showing up at real-world events. Until they started running for office. Until they showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. But by then, the mechanism had already been perfected. The blueprint had been written. The next conspiracy, whatever it is, whatever it'll be called, already knows the formula. Let me show you something that should terrify you. I can create a QAnon-style conspiracy right now, right here, and within seconds you'll feel the pull of it. Here's the premise. The world's 5 largest social media companies met in secret in 2019. They decided which information you'd be allowed to see. They decided which voices you'd be allowed to hear. They called it trust and safety. But here's what they didn't tell you. Did you feel it? That little spark of, wait, what? That's the hook. Now imagine I spent the next 30 minutes giving you ambiguous evidence, screenshots with no context, anonymous insider claims, patterns in unrelated events. Imagine I gave you a community of people who all see it too. Imagine I gave you a purpose. Share this before they take it down. You'd be 60 seconds away from the rabbit hole. And that's not because you're gullible. It's because the system is designed to exploit how human attention and emotion work. The algorithm isn't neutral. The algorithm rewards the content that triggers the strongest response. And conspiracies trigger nuclear responses. Now here's the hinge. Once QAnon had the attention, once it had the algorithm, once it had the community, it needed one more thing to become truly dangerous. It needed a narrative that could survive failure. Because here's what should have killed QAnon. The predictions kept not happening. The storm never came. The arrests never happened. Trump didn't reveal the truth in his second term because he didn't have a second term. So why didn't the movement collapse? That's what we need to talk about next. Because the answer explains why QAnon is still here, just under different names. Let me walk you through the single most important thing QAnon did, the thing that made it unkillable. QAnon built a narrative that could not lose. Every conspiracy theory makes predictions. And when those predictions fail, the theory dies. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how reality is supposed to correct delusion. But QAnon figured out a loophole. Make failure part of the narrative. Here's how it worked. Q would post cryptic hints about upcoming events. Something big is coming. Watch the news. The storm is upon us. Believers would decode these hints into specific predictions. Mass arrests on this date, revelations on that date, the cabal's downfall by this deadline. And then, nothing would happen. In a normal conspiracy theory, that's the end. The believers would realize they were wrong, feel embarrassed, and move on. But QAnon had built in a defense mechanism. Disinformation is necessary. Q explicitly told followers that some drops were meant to mislead the enemy, that the real plan was happening in secret, that the lack of visible results was actually proof. The plan was working, because if they could see it, so could the cabal. Read that again. The absence of evidence became evidence of absence, becoming evidence of presence. Failure became proof of success. This is what psychologists call a self-sealing belief system. Every possible outcome confirms the belief. If the prediction happens, the belief is confirmed. If the prediction doesn't happen, the belief is still confirmed because the failure was part of the plan. You see this in cults all the time. The apocalypse doesn't come on the predicted date, so the leader says, "Our faith delayed it," or "It's coming later," or "It happened spiritually." And the followers don't leave, they double down. Because leaving would mean admitting they were wrong, and humans will do almost anything to avoid that feeling. Now, here's where it gets psychologically sophisticated. QAnon didn't just make followers resistant to contradictory evidence. It made them seek out contradictory evidence so they could practice explaining it away. Believers would actively engage with debunkers, with fact-checkers, with mainstream news articles that disproved Q's claims, not to learn from them, to train against them. Every rebuttal became an opportunity to strengthen their counter-arguments. Every piece of contradictory evidence became proof of the cover-up. This is called inoculation theory in psychology. If you expose someone to weak versions of counter-arguments, they build up resistance to stronger versions later. QAnon believers were constantly inoculating themselves against reality, and the movement had another defense: trust the plan. These three words did so much work. They created a mantra that could answer any doubt, any question, any moment of uncertainty. You don't understand why nothing's happening? Trust the plan. You're worried that maybe you're wrong? Trust the plan. Your family thinks you're crazy? Trust the plan. It's a thought-stopping cliché, a phrase that ends critical thinking rather than encouraging it. And it worked because it gave believers permission to stop wrestling with cognitive dissonance. Stop questioning. Stop doubting. Just trust. But here's the most dangerous part of the narrative: the enemy. QAnon didn't just create a story about patriots saving children. It created a story about an enemy so evil, so powerful, so embedded in every institution, that any skepticism of QAnon could be explained as either ignorance or complicity. You don't believe in QAnon? You must be asleep. Or you must be part of the cabal. Or you must be brainwashed by the mainstream media, which is controlled by the cabal. This is classic totalizing ideology. It draws a circle around truth and says, everything inside this circle is real. Everything outside is lies. And once you're inside that circle, every relationship in your life gets redefined. Your family becomes a sleep sheep. Your friends become brainwashed. Experts become controlled opposition. Journalists become propaganda agents. Scientists become part of the cover-up. Elections become rigged. Courts become compromised. The only people you can trust are other believers. The only information you can trust is Q-aligned information. The only reality you can trust is the reality the movement provides. Do you see what this does? It doesn't just change what you believe. It changes how you believe. It changes your entire epistemology, your system for determining what's true. And once your epistemology is inside the bubble, you can't be reached from outside it, because every attempt to reach you gets interpreted through the bubble's logic. Evidence against QAnon becomes evidence of the cover-up. Debunking becomes propaganda. Concern becomes persecution. Now ask yourself, have you ever been in an argument where the other person interpreted every point you made as proof of your bias? Where they saw your sources as compromised, your logic as flawed, your intentions as suspicious? Where nothing you said could possibly change their mind because the framework they were using made your perspective impossible to credit? That's what a self-sealing narrative does. And QAnon perfected it. By 2020, the movement had hundreds of thousands of true believers who had reorganized their entire understanding of reality around Q's narrative. They weren't just reading conspiracy theories. They were living inside one. And that's when it stopped being a digital phenomenon. That's when belief demanded action. Here's your hinge. What happens when millions of people become convinced that children are being trafficked and tortured by a satanic cabal, that Trump is the only thing standing between America and total evil, and that they are digital soldiers in a secret war for the soul of civilization? What happens when people don't just believe something? They believe they have a duty to act on it? That's what we have to examine next, because this is where QAnon went from disturbing to dangerous. Let me tell you about a moment that should have been a wake-up call. December 4th, 2016. A man walks into a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., armed with an AR-15. He's there to investigate Pizzagate, the predecessor conspiracy to QAnon that claimed Hillary Clinton was running a child trafficking ring out of the restaurant's basement. He fires the rifle. Fortunately, no one is hurt. He surrenders to police. And in his statement, he says he was there to self-investigate the claims he'd read online. The restaurant didn't have a basement. Now, you might think, well, that was one guy, one disturbed individual. That's not representative of a movement. But here's what you need to understand. That wasn't an outlier. That was a prototype. Because QAnon didn't just create beliefs. It created a sense of moral urgency. It told followers that children were being tortured right now, that Satan-worshipping elites were drinking their blood right now, that if you knew this truth and did nothing, you were complicit. That's not just a conspiracy theory, that's a call to action. And action started happening, constantly. QAnon believers showed up at hospitals demanding to see rescued children. They harassed families of school shooting victims, accusing them of being crisis actors. They flooded hotlines meant for real trafficking victims with false reports. They stalked politicians and journalists they believed were part of the cabal. But the movement always had plausible deniability. Q never explicitly called for violence. The drops were vague enough that believers could claim they were just researching, or asking questions, or spreading awareness. And yet the violence kept happening. The harassment kept escalating. The threats kept coming. Why? Because QAnon had done something sophisticated. It had gamified extremism. Let me explain what I mean. In traditional extremist movements, there's usually a clear hierarchy. A leader gives orders. Followers obey. If someone commits violence, the connection between ideology and action is obvious. But QAnon was decentralized. There was no single leader telling people what to do. Instead, the movement created a framework for action. It told you who the enemies were. It told you the stakes were civilization level. It told you that you were a soldier in an information war. And then it said, do your own research. Think for yourself. Take action as you see fit. This is called stochastic terrorism, creating an environment where violence becomes statistically likely without any individual being directly responsible for ordering it. You radicalize a large enough group with extreme enough beliefs, and someone in that group will eventually take extreme action. And QAnon radicalized people fast. I've read hundreds of accounts from former believers and their families. The pattern is almost always the same. First, they stumble onto QAnon content. Maybe through a Facebook group about politics. Maybe through a YouTube video about corruption. Maybe through a friend who sends them a link and says, this is important. They start reading, they start watching, and those first few pieces seem plausible. Politicians are corrupt? Sure, that's obviously true. There's a deep state. Well, yeah, there are bureaucrats who outlast elected officials. The media is biased. Of course it is. Everyone knows that. This is the genius of the entry point. You don't start with Satan-worshipping pedophiles run the world. You start with something your target already half believes. You build on their existing skepticism. You validate their existing frustrations. Then you go deeper. Each piece of content introduces one more claim. Each claim comes with evidence, screenshots, videos, testimonials, expert analysis. Each piece of evidence comes with an explanation for why the mainstream won't report it. And before you know it, you're in the deep end. You're in the Telegram channels. You're in the obscure forums. You're watching 8-hour video compilations. You're creating your own threads connecting the dots. Your family notices you've changed. You're angry all the time. You're suspicious all the time. You're talking about things that sound insane. They try to talk to you about it. You tell them to do their research. They ask you to stop. You tell them they're asleep, and then you have to choose the people who love you but think you're crazy, or the community that validates you but demands total belief. For hundreds of thousands of people, the choice was the community. By 2020, QAnon had become a social phenomenon. Families were fracturing. Marriages were ending. Parents were losing contact with their children. Children were losing contact with their parents. All because one person had gone down the rabbit hole and couldn't climb back out. And the movement celebrated this. They called it the Great Awakening. They said losing relationships with non-believers was proof you were on the right path. They reframed isolation as purification. This is cult behavior, textbook cult behavior. Isolation from outside relationships, demand for total loyalty, reinterpretation of reality, creation of an us versus them worldview. But QAnon wasn't meeting in a compound in the desert. It was happening in suburban homes, in office break rooms, in family group chats. It was happening everywhere, all at once. And it was nearly invisible until it was too late. And then came January 6th, 2021. Now I need to be precise here. QAnon didn't cause January 6th. The attempt to overturn the election had multiple causes, multiple actors, multiple motivating ideologies. But QAnon was absolutely part of the ecosystem that made that day possible, because QAnon had spent 3 years teaching people that the election was going to be stolen. Trump was fighting a secret war against evil. You were a soldier in that war. The stakes were the fate of civilization itself. Sometimes patriots have to take action. When Trump lost the election, QAnon believers didn't accept it. How could they? Their entire worldview said Trump was the chosen one, the storm was coming, the cabal would be defeated. The election result didn't fit the narrative. So they did what they'd been trained to do. They reinterpreted reality. The election was stolen. The courts were compromised. The media was lying. The evidence was being suppressed. And Trump's calls to come to Washington on January 6th? That was the signal. That was the storm. We all know what happened next. The mob, the violence, the deaths, the attempted disruption of the constitutional process. And in the aftermath, Q went silent. No more drops, no more breadcrumbs, no more cryptic messages. The prophet disappeared. And here's what should have happened. The movement should have collapsed. The storm didn't come. The predictions failed. Trump didn't declare martial law. The cabal wasn't arrested. The Great Awakening didn't awaken. But that's not what happened. Instead, the movement did something that reveals the final, most disturbing truth about QAnon. It didn't need Q anymore. The system was self-sustaining. Let me show you what I mean. Because this is where we are right now. This is the world you're living in. After January 6th, the platforms finally acted with real force. They suspended tens of thousands of QAnon-associated accounts. They banned QAnon hashtags. They removed hundreds of groups. They demoted conspiracy content in their algorithms. And it worked, sort of. The QAnon brand became toxic. Saying, "I'm a QAnon believer," became social suicide in most circles. The movement lost its name recognition. The casual followers drifted away. But here's what the platforms didn't kill. The mechanism, the pattern, the process, the way of thinking that QAnon had trained into millions of people. Because QAnon had never really been about Q. It had been about teaching people a new way to process information, a new way to relate to authority, a new way to find meaning and community. And those lessons didn't disappear just because the Q account went silent. Let me show you what happened instead. QAnon fragmented. It splintered. It dissolved into 1,000 smaller conspiracies, each one carrying the DNA of the original. Some believers pivoted to COVID conspiracy theories. The virus was fake, or the vaccines were poison, or the pandemic was a cover for something darker. Same structure, hidden truth, evil conspiracy, awakened researchers. Everyone else is asleep. Some pivoted to election fraud claims, not just about 2020, but about every election going forward. Same structure, rigged system, stolen democracy, patriotic resistance, trust the plan. Some pivoted to anti-LGBTQ+ narratives, claiming schools were grooming children or that LGBTQ+ rights were part of a larger agenda to destroy families. Same structure, protecting children, evil agenda, secret coordination, moral urgency. The conspiracy changed, the mechanism didn't. And here's the truly disturbing part. New movements started using the QAnon playbook deliberately. I've tracked at least 24 conspiracy movements that have emerged since 2021, and almost all of them use the same tactics. Cryptic posts that require community decoding. Unfalsifiable claims that can survive any contradiction. Creation of in-group versus out-group identity. Exploitation of algorithmic incentives for engagement. Rapid migration across platforms when banned. Positioning of believers as researchers, not followers. They learned from QAnon. They saw what worked, and they're doing it again. But it's harder to track now, because it's not centralized around one account or one hashtag or one platform. It's distributed. It's ambient. It's in wellness communities and parenting groups and financial forums and political movements. The conspiracy theory isn't called QAnon anymore. But the mental habits QAnon created are everywhere. Let me give you an example. I'm going to describe a pattern, and I want you to tell me if you've seen it. Someone shares a claim online. The claim is alarming, about health or politics or social issues. The claim comes with, "Do your own research." When you ask for sources, they send you links to blogs, to obscure websites, to video testimonials, to alternative media. When you point out these sources aren't credible, they say mainstream sources are compromised. When you point out the claim has been debunked, they say fact-checkers are in on it. When you express skepticism, they say you're closed-minded or brainwashed or controlled. Have you seen that? I'm guessing you have. Because that's not QAnon. That's just the water we swim in now. QAnon normalized a style of conspiratorial thinking that has become ambient in our culture. It made skepticism of expertise mainstream. It made distrust of institutions commonplace. It made the idea of hidden evil cabals seem plausible rather than absurd. And here's the challenge. Some skepticism of expertise is healthy. Some distrust of institutions is warranted. There are real conspiracies. There is real corruption. There are real cover-ups. So how do you tell the difference? How do you distinguish between healthy skepticism and conspiratorial thinking? Between justified distrust and paranoid delusion? Between legitimate investigation and rabbit hole addiction? That's the question that QAnon's legacy forces us to answer. Because the tools that help you spot a conspiracy theory are the same tools that help you spot real corruption. And the rhetoric that dismisses conspiracy theories can be used to dismiss legitimate criticism. This is the epistemological crisis QAnon left behind. We no longer agree on how to determine what's true. Some people trust institutions and credentials and peer review. Some people trust independent researchers and alternative media and crowdsourced investigation. Some people trust personal experience and intuition and pattern recognition. And we can't even agree on which of these methods is legitimate. QAnon didn't create this crisis, but it exploited it. It weaponized it. It made it worse. And here's what keeps me up at night. I don't know how we fix it, because you can't just tell people trust the experts. We've seen too many examples of experts being wrong, of institutions lying, of authorities covering up. You can't just tell people do your own research. We've seen too many examples of people researching themselves into delusion, of communities reinforcing false beliefs, of algorithms feeding confirmation bias. The tools we use to create shared reality have been broken. And I don't know if they can be repaired. But I do know this. The next QAnon is already forming. Maybe not with that name. Maybe not with those specific claims. But somewhere, right now, someone is posting cryptic messages that a community is learning to decode. Someone is creating a narrative that can't lose. Someone is building an identity around hidden truth. And the algorithm is watching, learning, optimizing, ready to spread whatever pattern generates the most engagement. So what do we do? That's what I want to talk about in the final section. Because I promised you something at the start. A test, a tool, a way to protect yourself and the people you love from the next conspiracy that goes viral. I'm going to give that to you now, but I need you to understand. This isn't a magic bullet. This isn't a simple fix. This is just a starting point. Because the truth is, there's no inoculation against conspiracies. There's no way to make yourself immune. You can only make yourself aware. So let's get you aware. All right, we've been through the entire story. You've seen how QAnon was born, how it spread, why it worked, what it did, and where it went. Now I'm going to give you what I promised. The 3-question test that can expose any viral conspiracy in minutes. These 3 questions aren't about specific claims. They're about structure. They're about the shape of the narrative you're being sold. And once you learn to recognize that shape, you can spot a conspiracy before it hooks you. Question 1. What would prove this wrong? This is the single most important question you can ask about any claim. If someone tells you there's a secret cabal running the world, ask, what evidence would prove that wrong? If they say, there's no evidence that could prove it wrong because the cabal controls all evidence, you're not dealing with a theory. You're dealing with unfalsifiable belief. Real claims can be disproven. They have limits, they have boundaries, they have failure conditions. The Earth is round can be disproven. You could fly to Antarctica and prove there's no ice wall. Vaccines prevent disease can be disproven. You could run controlled studies showing they don't work. But a secret cabal is orchestrating everything can't be disproven. Every piece of contradictory evidence gets absorbed into the conspiracy. That's not knowledge. That's faith. If you can't imagine what would prove something wrong, you can't know if it's right. Question 2. Who profits if I believe this? Every piece of viral content exists for a reason. Someone benefits from its spread. Sometimes the profit is obvious. Someone's selling books, supplements, courses, subscriptions. If the conspiracy theory comes with a marketplace, that's a red flag. Sometimes the profit is attention. Influencers gain followers, podcasters gain listeners, YouTubers gain subscribers. If the person spreading the theory is building a platform on it, that's a red flag. Sometimes the profit is political. The conspiracy serves a specific ideology, demonizes specific opponents, mobilizes specific voters. If the theory conveniently aligns with a pre-existing political agenda, that's a red flag. And sometimes the profit is psychological. The believer gets to feel smart, enlightened, special, part of an elite group that sees what others can't. If believing the theory makes you feel superior to non-believers, that's a red flag. Real information doesn't usually come with a profit motive, or when it does, the motive is transparent and the information can be verified independently. Question 3. What does it ask me to stop trusting? This is the question that reveals whether something is trying to isolate you. QAnon asked believers to stop trusting. Mainstream media, fact-checkers, scientists, doctors, elections, courts, law enforcement, politicians, except Trump, celebrities, journalists, their own family members who didn't believe. That's a lot of trust cutting. And notice the pattern. It's asking you to cut ties with anything that might contradict the conspiracy. Healthy skepticism says, verify claims, check sources, think critically. Conspiratorial thinking says, trust only us, ignore everyone else, they're all compromised. If a belief system requires you to cut ties with every external source of verification, it's not teaching you to think freely. It's teaching you to think inside a cage. Real knowledge invites challenge. It says, here's my evidence, here's my reasoning, go verify it yourself with whoever you trust. Conspiracy thinking says, if you check with anyone outside our community, You're letting the enemy win. So those are your 3 questions. 1. What would prove this wrong? 2. Who profits if I believe it? 3. What does it ask me to stop trusting? And here's how you use them. The next time you encounter a claim that feels big, that feels urgent, that feels like it explains everything, pause. Don't immediately share it. Don't immediately believe it. Don't immediately dismiss it. Just ask the 3 questions. If you can't think of anything that would disprove the claim, be suspicious. If someone is making money or gaining power from spreading the claim, be suspicious. If the claim asks you to cut ties with every source that might contradict it, be suspicious. And if the claim fails all 3 questions, walk away. You're looking at a rabbit hole, not a revelation. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. But what about real conspiracies? Don't they fail these tests too? And the answer is no, they don't. Real conspiracies, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Tuskegee, MK-Ultra, all had evidence that could have disproven them. They had specific claims about specific events. They didn't require you to distrust every institution on Earth. They didn't create unfalsifiable narratives. And when they were exposed, it was through traditional journalism, through whistleblowers with documents, through legal processes, not through cryptic posts decoded by anonymous researchers on fringe message boards. The difference between a real conspiracy and a conspiracy theory isn't the weirdness of the claim. It's the structure of the evidence. So use the test, teach the test, share the test. Because here's the final truth I need you to understand. QAnon wasn't an anomaly. It was a preview. The conditions that made QAnon possible haven't changed. The algorithms that spread it are still running. The psychological vulnerabilities it exploited are still there. The epistemological crisis it worsened is still unresolved, which means the next one is coming. Maybe it'll be about a different enemy. Maybe it'll use different symbols. Maybe it'll spread on different platforms. But it'll use the same mechanism, the same pattern, the same exploitation of human psychology and algorithmic incentives. And when it comes, you'll have a choice. Get swept up in it or recognize it for what it is. I've given you the tools to recognize it. Use them. Subscribe if you want more investigations like this one. I'm tracking the movements that are already using the QAnon playbook, and you'll want to see what I find. Comment test below, and I'll pin the 3-question checklist so you can save it, share it, use it, and send this to one person you care about. Not to start an argument, not to prove you're right, just to give them the same tools I've given you. Because this isn't about winning debates. It's about keeping people you love from getting lost. QAnon broke reality for millions of people. Some of them were someone's parent, someone's friend, someone's partner, someone's child. The next one will break reality for millions more, unless we learn to spot it, unless we learn to resist it, unless we learn to ask the right questions before we fall for the wrong answers. The next QAnon won't look like QAnon. It won't use the same name or the same symbols or the same claims, but it'll have the same shape, the same structure, the same DNA, and now you know what to look for. Stay awake, stay critical, stay connected to the people who love you, and remember, you're not immune to manipulation. None of us are. But you can be aware of it. You can catch yourself. You can ask the questions. What would prove this wrong? Who profits if I believe it? What does it ask me to stop trusting? 3 questions. That's all it takes. Use them well.